Well, welcome back. It's great that you've joined me again as we continue to work our way through John's Gospel. I hope I can really help you as you continue to read or listen to the audio files. It really is a book that can change your life. I hope the tools are becoming a little bit more comfortable, chapters and verses, that this is eyewitness testimony. We can trust what we're reading, and I'm just going to pray for God's help for me and for you. Father, please open our eyes so that we can see who Jesus is and believe in him. Amen. Well, I hope you're familiar, or at least more familiar now, with the two questions that we would have talked about in between the introductory video and this one. What does it mean for Jesus to be the Christ, the Son of God? And what does it mean to believe in him? These are questions that John is really keen to help us understand as we read his Gospel. And John answers these two questions in great depth through 7 signs or 7 miracles that he records. And as we thought last week, John is writing an eyewitness account. He was there, he saw these miracles. And today we're going to be looking at the first sign that Jesus did, the first sign that John records. And that's John chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. So if you haven't got that open, do open it. You'll have read it or listened to it on audio from the last 3 chapters, but it might be helpful to have it open again. So I'll just read John chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. On the 3rd day there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no more wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine, but you've kept the good wine until now." This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. I don't know what is the best party you've ever been to. For me, I can look back at some student parties which I really thoroughly enjoyed, and some great weddings that I've been to. Great food, great wine, great company, and the heart of it, a celebration of a relationship. Well, is this what this is about? Is this saying that Jesus can throw a great party? He can make vast quantities of wine? I mean, there's a lot here about the wine, isn't there? Firstly, Mary, Jesus' mother, tells them that they've run out of wine. And she clearly expects Jesus to be able to do something about it. But Jesus responds in verse 4. "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." Now, throughout John's Gospel, his hour, Jesus' hour, is the hour of his glory. And as we'll see, it's the hour of his death and resurrection. Glory is just a Bible word to say impressive, fantastic, weighty, of substance. And Jesus is saying, that it's not time for me to reveal my glory. But nevertheless, he goes ahead and does this miracle and reveals something of who he really is. So Mary tells the servants to do whatever he says. And Jesus tells them to fill some jars with water. Now, each of these purification jars holds 20 to 30 gallons. That's about 70 to 100 litres. And there are 6 of them. And then Jesus tells the servants to take the water to the master of the banquet, the man who knew his wine, who knew his food. And when he tastes the wine, that the master of the feast, the master of the banquet, tells off the bridegroom, doesn't he? It was the bridegroom's responsibility to pay for all the food and wine. But the master of the banquet says to the bridegroom, everyone serves the good wine first. And when the people have had too much to drink, then the poor wine. But you've kept the good wine until now. What are you doing? Well, you see, Jesus had just made 560 bottles of the best quality wine. The kind of wine that if you tasted, you'd just say, wow, Wes, this must have cost a fair packet. And John comments in verse 11, this, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. We know Cana was a real place. They're excavating it at this moment in time. I've put a picture on the front of this recording. It's a real place. This really happened. John saw it happen. But what does it mean? Does it mean that Jesus is a great guy to have around if you've run out of wine? That if you've forgotten to go to the off license, don't worry, Jesus can make some wine for you? No, it's much better than that. See, what this means would not have been lost on those first disciples because they would have read the Old Testament. The Old Testament is about 39 books written over a 2,000-year period that point forward to what God is going to do in the future when his Messiah comes. And so it's easy for us to miss the meaning, the glory, if you like, of what Jesus is doing here. It's just not just a conjuring trick to make some wine. What are the clues that help us understand what this first sign means? Well, at the end of chapter 1, Jesus has said, and you might want to look at the last verse of chapter 1, truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Why does he say that? Well, Nathanael has just come to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, the King of Israel, because Jesus says he saw him under his fig tree before he even met Jesus. And then Jesus says, look, you're going to see greater things than that. And then he really sort of helps Nathanael remember this incident in the Old Testament with Jacob, or Israel, in Genesis, where Israel had a vision of angels ascending and descending on the place where he was sleeping, and he called that place Bethel, which means house of God. So that's what is going on just before this first sign. And then after this sign, Jesus goes to the temple, the house of God, the place where God would meet with his people, and he's really upset about the religious corruption. He turns out over these tables, and then the Pharisees and the other rulers of the temple say, well, who do you think you are to do this? And Jesus says, destroy this temple and raise it again in 3 days. And John realizes later that Jesus is talking about himself, about his body. So Jesus, before and after, is saying that he's the place where people meet with God. And that helps us to understand what's going on here when Jesus turns water into wine. Because about 600 years before, a prophet called Isaiah had said this about what God was going to come and do. On this mountain, and the mountain he's referring to is the mountain on which the temple was built, Isaiah says in chapter 25, and it should pop up on the screen of the recording as I read it, on this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, a feast of aged wine well refined, and he will swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over all peoples, the veil that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces. Wow. God is saying through Isaiah that he will come and he will get rid of death for all people. He will wipe away all tears from all faces. And the sign that he's doing that is a feast of aged wine, of good wine. So that probably helps us to understand what the disciples would have understood from this first of Jesus' miracles. What John is saying is that Here is the one who's come to swallow up death forever, to wipe away all tears. And he's showing that he's the one who can do that by miraculously providing a feast of aged good wine. So I don't know whether we're party animals or whether we're introverts, but all of us, whoever we are, like a good feast, don't we? It's a time of joy. And what John is saying here is that God is the kind of God who's into joy, who's into feasts, and he wants to get rid of things that stop joy and feasting. He wants to swallow up death forever, get rid of sadness and tears. Now, the video I have attached to this talk is one of celebrity weddings. I don't know if you're into that kind of thing. I'm not particularly. And often they're so opulent, aren't they? They're almost distasteful. But I guess feasting and weddings and parties are always distasteful for those who are poor and dying and downtrodden. But if God is the kind of God who wants to get rid of poverty and rid of death and rid of sin and all the things that stop our celebration, then there's nothing to get in the way of genuine, over-the-top, generous feasting and joy. And in some sense, all those events in our lives point forward to that. A day that is coming when God will gather his people in a great feast with aged wine, with death a distant memory and tears wiped away. Now, if that is true, if that is real, that's at least worth finding out about, isn't it? And so stick with John's Gospel as we read through it. It's a mouth-watering prospect. So do keep working through John's Gospel, either by listening to the audio recordings or reading through the next chapters 4, 5 and 6. And thanks very much for listening. Thanks very much for being with me. I do hope that this is helpful. And if it is helpful, it'd be great if you could subscribe to the channel and maybe click the like button. But I hope you'll enjoy reading through chapters 4, 5 and 6 and looking forward to Zoom calling you in the week to come. But thanks very much for listening.